The sun was setting over the bustling streets of a busy city, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Judge Marcus Thompson, a well-respected figure in the community, was driving home after a long day at the courthouse. Known for his fairness and dedication to justice, Marcus had spent years working tirelessly to make the legal system better, not just for some, but for everyone. That evening, however, he found himself in a situation no one could have predicted. As Marcus approached a quiet intersection, he noticed flashing lights behind him. Confused, he glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His seatbelt was on, his car registration was up to date, and he hadn't broken any traffic rules. Still, the red and blue lights continued to blink as the police car pulled closer. With a deep breath, Marcus signaled and carefully pulled over to the side of the road. Officer Ryan Callahan stepped out of his patrol car, his demeanor aggressive from the start. He approached Marcus's vehicle with quick, heavy steps, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. License and registration. He barked through the open window, his tone sharp and confrontational. Marcus remained calm, despite the tension in the air. He turned off the engine, placed his hands on the steering wheel where they were clearly visible, and politely replied, "Of course, officer. May I ask what this is about?" Ignoring the question, Officer Callahan leaned into the window, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus. It didn't take long for Marcus to realize that something felt off about the encounter. The officer's gaze lingered too long, his body language radiating hostility rather than professionalism. When Marcus handed over his documents, including his judge's ID badge, Officer Callahan barely glanced at them before tossing them onto the hood of the car. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly. By now, a small crowd had gathered nearby. Some passers-by slowed down to watch, while others whipped out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Whispers rippled through the group as people recognized the man sitting in the driver's seat. It was Judge Thompson, a name synonymous with integrity and fairness in the city. A few shouted questions at the officer, asking why such a prominent figure was being treated this way. But Officer Callahan ignored them all, his focus solely on Marcus. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked again, his voice steady but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." Instead of answering, the officer raised his voice. "You're under investigation for suspicious activity. Now step out of the car." Suspicious activity. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. He tried to reason with the officer, explaining that he was simply heading home after work. But every attempt to de-escalate only seemed to make things worse. The atmosphere grew more charged by the second, and it became clear that this wasn't going to end quietly. For Marcus, the irony of the moment wasn't lost. Here he was, a judge who had devoted his life to upholding the law, being treated like a criminal without cause. As the crowd grew larger and louder, Marcus knew this incident would leave a mark, not just on him, but on the entire community. What happened next would shock not only those watching, but also the nation. As the tension escalated, Judge Marcus Thompson remained calm, his years of experience in high-pressure situations helping him keep his composure. He knew that losing his temper or reacting impulsively would only make things worse. Standing beside his car, with the flashing lights of the patrol vehicle illuminating the scene, Marcus looked Officer Ryan Callahan directly in the eye. "Officer," he said firmly but respectfully, "I've shown you my credentials. I'm a sitting judge. Can we please resolve this misunderstanding?" But Officer Callahan wasn't listening. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Instead of responding to Marcus's questions, he began barking orders again, demanding that Marcus place his hands behind his back. The crowd watching nearby grew restless, their murmurs turning into louder protests. Some shouted, "What's the charge?" while others called out, "This isn't right." Phones continued to record every moment, capturing not just the altercation, but also the growing anger in the air. Marcus tried one more time to reason with the officer. "Sir, if there's an issue, let's handle it properly. You can call the station, verify who I am." "This is unnecessary." His words were measured, his tone unwavering. But Officer Callahan seemed unmoved, almost as if he had already made up his mind about how this encounter would end. He ignored Marcus's suggestions and reached for his handcuffs, snapping them tightly around the judge's wrists. The sound of the metal clicking shut echoed through the street, sending a ripple of disbelief through the onlookers. Many couldn't believe what they were witnessing: a respected public official being treated like a common criminal. A young woman in the crowd gasped, her phone trembling slightly as she filmed the scene. An older man shook his head, muttering, "This is wrong. Plain wrong." For Marcus, the moment felt surreal. He had spent his entire career ensuring justice was served fairly, yet here he was, standing on the side of the road, accused of something he hadn't done. As the officer led him toward the patrol car, Marcus glanced at the faces of the people gathered around. Some looked angry, others confused, but most wore expressions of shock and disbelief. He realized then that this wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. Officer Callahan opened the door to the patrol car and instructed Marcus to get inside. Before doing so, Marcus turned slightly to address the crowd. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We'll get to the truth. Justice will prevail." His words hung in the air, resonating with those who heard them. Even some of the officers standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. Once inside the patrol car, Marcus sat quietly, processing everything that had happened. He replayed the events in his mind: the aggressive tone, the refusal to listen, the lack of explanation. It was clear that this wasn't a routine traffic stop gone wrong. It was something deeper, something rooted in bias and prejudice. And as the car pulled away from the curb, Marcus knew this incident wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. Back at the scene, the crowd lingered, unwilling to disperse. People shared their videos on social media, tagging local news outlets and activists. Within minutes, the hashtag Justice for Judge Thompson began trending online. Commenters expressed outrage, calling for accountability and transparency. Others shared stories of similar encounters they or their loved ones had experienced, highlighting the systemic issues at play. Meanwhile, Marcus's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, though he couldn't reach it while cuffed. Calls and messages poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers offering support. By the time the patrol car arrived at the station, word of the arrest had spread far beyond the neighborhood. What started as a routine drive home had turned into a national conversation, and Judge Marcus Thompson was now at the center of it all. By the time the patrol car arrived at the station, Judge Marcus Thompson's arrest had become a storm that no one could ignore. The small crowd at the scene of the traffic stop had grown into a sea of people flooding social media with videos, comments, and demands for answers. Hashtags like #Justice for Judge Thompson and #AccountabilityNow dominated Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook feeds. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, and within hours, it was everywhere, on television, radio, and online platforms. What should have been a quiet evening for Marcus had turned into a national spectacle. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Ryan Callahan handed Marcus off to another officer, who escorted him to a holding area without explanation. Marcus remained composed, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. He knew the system better than almost anyone in the room, but being on this side of it was an entirely different experience. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, a feeling he despised but understood far too well from the countless stories he'd heard during his career. As the night wore on, Marcus's family sprang into action. His wife, Alina, a former prosecutor herself, immediately called their attorney, Sarah Collins, one of the best civil rights lawyers in the city. Together, they began working tirelessly to secure his release. Alina's hands trembled as she dialed number after number, her frustration mounting with each unanswered call. "This can't be happening," she muttered under her breath, pacing back and forth in their living room. Their 2 teenage children sat silently on the couch, glued to their phones as updates about their father spread across the internet. Outside the station, the protests grew louder. Community leaders, activists, and even strangers showed up to demand justice. Signs reading "Respect our leaders" and "No justice, no peace" filled the air, while chants echoed through the streets. Local news crews set up cameras, capturing every moment of the demonstration. Prominent figures weighed in, including politicians, celebrities, and influential voices from across the country. One activist took to the microphone, addressing the crowd. "If this can happen to someone like Judge Thompson, a man of authority, a symbol of fairness, then none of us are safe. We need change, and we need it now." Meanwhile, the viral videos of the arrest painted a damning picture. In clip after clip, viewers saw Officer Callahan's aggressive demeanor contrast sharply with Marcus's calm and respectful responses. Commenters dissected every detail, pointing out inconsistencies in the officer's behavior and questioning his motives. Some dug deeper, uncovering past complaints filed against Callahan for excessive force and racial profiling. Each new revelation fueled the growing outrage, putting immense pressure on both the police department and city officials to respond. Back inside the station, Marcus sat alone in a cold, sterile room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Despite the chaos swirling around him, his thoughts remained focused. He replayed the events of the evening, analyzing every word, every action. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the larger issues at play. If he didn't speak up now, who would? And so, even in the face of adversity, Marcus resolved to use this moment as a catalyst for change. As dawn approached, negotiations finally began to bear fruit. Thanks to relentless efforts by Sarah Collins and mounting public pressure, the police chief agreed to release Marcus pending further investigation. When the doors of the precinct opened and Marcus stepped outside, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Cameras flashed, capturing the weary but determined expression on his face. As he raised a hand to acknowledge the support, he knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Marcus was ready to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who deserved justice. The moment Judge Marcus Thompson stepped into the precinct, he was hit by a wave of conflicting emotions. The sterile, harsh environment of the station felt foreign to him, a place where he had often sent offenders, but never imagined he'd find himself. As he sat in the cold, dimly lit holding area, his mind drifted between the present chaos and memories of his journey to becoming a judge. Each flashback served as a reminder of why he couldn't let this moment break him. When an officer finally approached to process him, Marcus seized the opportunity to assert his rights. "I want to speak to my attorney immediately," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, though there was no sense of urgency in his movements. Marcus knew how these situations could drag on. Hours wasted while those in power tried to wear you down. But he refused to be intimidated. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto the officer's. "And I'd like to know the exact charges against me." The officer mumbled something vague about pending investigation and walked away without elaborating. Marcus clenched his jaw but kept his composure. He understood that losing control now would only play into their hands. Instead, he used the quiet moments to reflect on everything that had led him here. The struggles, the victories, and the people who had inspired him along the way. One memory stood out vividly: his early days as a young lawyer fresh out of law school. Back then, he had worked tirelessly at a small nonprofit, defending clients who couldn't afford representation. Many of them were poor, marginalized, and treated unfairly by the system. One case in particular haunted him: a young black man wrongfully accused of theft because of racial profiling. Marcus had fought tooth and nail to prove his innocence, and when the verdict came back not guilty, it solidified his belief in justice. That same passion had driven him to become a judge, to ensure fairness wasn't just an ideal but a reality. Now, sitting in that cold room, Marcus realized how personal this ordeal felt. It wasn't just about him being detained. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed or mistreated because of the color of their skin. His thoughts turned to his own children, watching videos of his arrest online. What message would this send them? Would they see their father as a victim or as someone who stood up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him? Time seemed to crawl as Marcus waited for updates. Occasionally, officers passed by, glancing at him with expressions ranging from indifference to thinly veiled hostility. None offered answers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his attorney, Sarah Collins, arrived. Her presence brought a surge of relief, though her expression was grim. "Marcus," she said quietly, pulling up a chair beside him, "we're going to get you out of here, but we need to stay strategic." Together, they reviewed the details of the arrest, discussing potential legal strategies. Sarah assured him that public pressure was mounting and that the police department was under scrutiny. Still, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just one night. This was about accountability, not just for Officer Callahan, but for a system that allowed such incidents to happen repeatedly. As dawn broke outside, Marcus was finally released pending further review of the charges. Stepping out of the precinct, he was greeted by cheers from the crowd still gathered there. Cameras flashed, capturing his weary yet resolute face. For a brief moment, he paused, taking in the sea of supporters. Then, raising a hand to acknowledge them, he spoke softly but with conviction. "This isn't over. Justice isn't just a word, it's a promise, and I intend to keep fighting until that promise is fulfilled." Though exhausted, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This experience had shaken him, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. After all, he had spent his life preparing for moments like this, not just to endure injustice, but to dismantle it. By the time Judge Marcus Thompson walked out of the precinct, the city was already ablaze with emotion. News of his detention had ignited a firestorm, and protests were spreading like wildfire. What began as a small gathering outside the police station had grown into massive demonstrations across neighborhoods, parks, and even downtown streets. People from all walks of life joined in. Students, parents, professionals, activists, all united by a shared sense of outrage and a demand for justice. The morning news channels couldn't stop talking about it. Headlines blared phrases like "respected judge detained" and "city demands accountability." Social media feeds were flooded with posts analyzing every detail of the incident. Videos of Marcus's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Officer Ryan Callahan's aggressive behavior, sparking heated debates online. Prominent figures weighed in, amplifying the call for answers. A well-known civil rights leader tweeted, "If they can treat Judge Thompson this way, imagine what ordinary citizens face daily." This is not just about one man. It's about systemic failure. At the heart of the protests stood community leaders who worked tirelessly to channel the anger into meaningful action. They organized rallies, marches, and town hall meetings to discuss next steps. One such event took place in front of the courthouse where Marcus often presided. Hundreds gathered, holding signs that read "Justice without fear" and "Protect our leaders." Speakers took turns addressing the crowd, sharing personal stories of encounters with law enforcement that mirrored Marcus's experience. Each story added fuel to the growing movement. Meanwhile, journalists began digging deeper into Officer Callahan's past. Reports surfaced revealing a troubling pattern: multiple complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional conduct. Yet, despite these allegations, Callahan had faced little to no disciplinary action. The revelations only intensified public fury. Protesters demanded transparency, calling for an independent investigation into both the officer's actions and the broader practices of the police department. "We need more than apologies," one activist shouted during a rally. "We need accountability." As pressure mounted, city officials scrambled to respond. The mayor held an emergency press conference, promising swift action. "This incident has shaken our community, and we are committed to getting to the truth," she declared. She announced plans for an independent task force to review the case, pledging reforms if misconduct was found. While some appreciated the gesture, others remained skeptical. "Promises aren't enough," muttered a protester holding a megaphone. "We've heard this before." For Marcus, the days following his release were a whirlwind. He attended meetings with lawyers, gave interviews to reporters, and met with community leaders to strategize. Despite the exhaustion, he refused to step back. Every phone call, every meeting, every conversation reinforced his belief that this moment could spark real change. He knew the spotlight wouldn't last forever, so he pushed harder, determined to make the most of it. One evening, as he prepared for another interview, Marcus reflected on the overwhelming support he'd received. Messages poured in from strangers thanking him for standing firm. Many expressed how his resilience inspired them to speak up about their own experiences. It reminded him that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who felt voiceless. Standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, Marcus whispered to himself, "This is bigger than me." Outside, the chants of protesters echoed through the streets, a reminder that the fight was far from over. But for now, the city was awake, its people demanding justice, and Marcus intended to lead the charge. The weeks following Judge Marcus Thompson's arrest felt like a turning point for the city. The independent investigation into Officer Ryan Callahan's actions became the center of attention, with everyone, from ordinary citizens to national news outlets, waiting anxiously for answers. The pressure on city officials and the police department was immense as protests continued to draw thousands to the streets. Each day brought new developments, keeping the story alive in headlines and conversations across the country. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the findings were released. The report painted a damning picture of Officer Callahan's conduct. Investigators concluded that his decision to detain Marcus had been based on flawed reasoning and lacked proper justification. Even more troubling was the revelation that Callahan had ignored standard protocols when dealing with public officials, choosing instead to escalate the situation unnecessarily. The report also highlighted patterns of similar behavior in Callahan's past, citing several unresolved complaints against him. In response, the police chief announced immediate consequences. Officer Callahan was suspended without pay and faced criminal charges for misconduct. Additionally, the department pledged sweeping reforms aimed at addressing systemic issues within its ranks. These included mandatory bias training, stricter accountability measures, and increased oversight of officers with histories of complaints. While some praised these steps as a sign of progress, others remained cautious, pointing out that promises of reform had been made and broken before. Judge Thompson addressed the public shortly after the announcement. Standing behind a podium outside the courthouse, he spoke with the same calm authority that had defined him throughout the ordeal. "This is not just about me," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about every person who has ever been treated unfairly because of their race, their background, or simply because someone in power decided they could." He went on to thank the community for its unwavering support, acknowledging that their collective voice had pushed this case into the spotlight. But Marcus didn't stop there. He used the moment to call for deeper change, urging lawmakers and civic leaders to take bold action. "Accountability is important, but it's only the first step," he said. "We need lasting solutions, policies that protect everyone equally, no matter who they are or where they come from." His words resonated deeply, inspiring renewed calls for legislative action at both local and national levels. As the dust began to settle, Marcus returned to his courtroom duties, though things weren't quite the same. Reporters still lingered outside his office, hoping for comments, and strangers approached him in public to express gratitude. Some even shared their own stories of injustice, seeking advice or simply wanting to be heard. Marcus listened patiently, understanding that his role now extended beyond the bench. He had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even those in positions of power weren't immune to systemic flaws. Despite the progress, questions lingered. Would the reforms stick? Or would they fade away once the media frenzy died down? Could true accountability exist within a system that had long resisted change? For Marcus, these uncertainties only strengthened his resolve. He threw himself into advocacy work, partnering with organizations focused on police reform and racial justice. Together, they drafted proposals, lobbied lawmakers, and organized educational campaigns to keep the momentum going. One evening, as Marcus sat at his desk reviewing documents for an upcoming hearing, he paused to reflect on how much had changed since that fateful night. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. This experience had awakened something powerful, not just in him, but in the entire community. People were speaking up, demanding better, refusing to stay silent. And while the fight for justice was far from over, Marcus knew they were moving in the right direction. With a deep breath, he picked up his pen and got back to work. The battle wasn't won yet, but Marcus Thompson wasn't about to give up. Not now, not ever. Months after the incident, the city had begun to settle into a fragile sense of calm, though the scars of that night still lingered. The fallout from Judge Marcus Thompson's detention had forced uncomfortable conversations about accountability, bias, and systemic injustice into the public eye. For many, it was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that even someone as respected and influential as Marcus wasn't immune to the flaws in the system. But while some progress had been made, questions remained about whether true justice had been served. Officer Ryan Callahan's suspension and criminal charges were seen by many as a victory, but others argued it wasn't enough. One bad apple doesn't spoil the whole bunch, a local activist said during a community meeting. But what happens when the whole orchard is rotten? Firing one officer won't fix decades of broken trust. These words resonated deeply with those who believed the reforms announced by the police department were merely surface-level fixes, bandages on wounds that needed surgery. Judge Thompson understood this sentiment better than most. He knew that holding one person accountable wouldn't dismantle the larger structures that allowed such incidents to happen repeatedly. Still, he refused to let cynicism overshadow hope. In interviews and public appearances, Marcus emphasized the importance of persistence. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, he often said. But every step forward counts, no matter how small. True to his word, Marcus threw himself into advocacy work with relentless energy. He partnered with grassroots organizations, legal experts, and lawmakers to push for meaningful reform. Together, they drafted legislation aimed at increasing transparency within law enforcement, including measures like body cameras for all officers, independent review boards for misconduct cases, and stricter penalties for violations of protocol. They also advocated for investment in community programs designed to bridge gaps between residents and police. Marcus's efforts didn't stop there. Recognizing the power of storytelling, he began speaking at schools, colleges, and community centers, sharing his experience and urging young people to use their voices. "You don't have to be a judge or a politician to make a difference," he told a packed auditorium of students one evening. "Every act of courage matters. Every question you ask, every protest you join, every conversation you start, it all adds up." His message inspired many, especially younger generations eager to shape a better future. Despite his determination, Marcus faced challenges along the way. Some critics accused him of using his ordeal for personal gain, while others dismissed his calls for reform as unrealistic. There were days when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, but Marcus leaned on his family, friends, and supporters to keep going. Elena, his wife, became a pillar of strength, reminding him why they started this journey in the first place. "This isn't just your fight," she told him one night. "It's ours, and we're not backing down." As time passed, signs of progress emerged. The proposed reforms gained traction, earning support from key policymakers. Community police relations slowly improved, thanks in part to dialogue sessions organized by activists and officials. Even Officer Callahan's trial sparked important discussions about implicit bias and the need for cultural sensitivity training. Yet, Marcus remained cautious. He knew that real change required vigilance and commitment, a constant effort to hold institutions accountable. At a press conference marking 6 months since his arrest, he addressed the crowd with characteristic resolve. "We've taken steps forward, but our work is far from done," he said. "Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And I intend to walk this path until fairness becomes the rule, not the exception." The audience erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the square. As Marcus stepped away from the podium, he felt a mix of pride and purpose. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but he was ready. After all, he had spent his life fighting for justice, and now, more than ever, he understood what was at stake. Months turned into years, and Judge Marcus Thompson's name became synonymous with resilience, courage, and the fight for justice. The incident that had once seemed like a personal ordeal transformed into a catalyst for widespread change, leaving an indelible mark on the city and the nation. What started as a single moment of injustice grew into a movement, inspiring countless individuals to question the status quo and demand accountability. Marcus didn't slow down after the initial wave of reforms. If anything, his determination only deepened. He continued working tirelessly, partnering with advocacy groups to push for systemic changes that went beyond policing. His focus expanded to include education, housing, and economic opportunities, recognizing that true justice required addressing the root causes of inequality. "You can't fix one part of the system without looking at the whole," he often said during speeches. "It's all connected." His efforts paid off in unexpected ways. New legislation was passed, mandating transparency in law enforcement and creating pathways for communities to hold institutions accountable. Schools introduced programs teaching students about civic engagement and civil rights, empowering the next generation to become active participants in shaping society. Even corporate leaders began stepping up, pledging funds to support marginalized communities and promote diversity within their organizations. But perhaps Marcus's most lasting impact came from the stories he shared. Through interviews, op-eds, and public appearances, he used his platform to amplify voices that might otherwise have gone unheard. He spoke candidly about his own experience, how it felt to be detained despite doing nothing wrong, how it forced him to confront the realities of bias and privilege, and how it strengthened his resolve to create a fairer world. His vulnerability resonated deeply, earning him respect not just as a judge, but as a human being who refused to stay silent. Young people, in particular, found inspiration in Marcus's journey. At a youth summit held in his honor, dozens of teenagers lined up to thank him for showing them what leadership looked like. One high school senior approached the microphone during a Q&A session and asked, "How do you keep going when things feel hopeless?" Marcus smiled warmly before answering, "Hope isn't something you wait for. It's something you create. Every small action matters. When you stand up for what's right, you give others permission to do the same." As time went on, Marcus's legacy extended beyond policy changes and protests. It lived in the everyday actions of those he inspired. The teacher who advocated for underfunded schools, the neighbor who organized community cleanups, the young lawyer who chose to work pro bono cases. People began to see themselves as agents of change, realizing that even the smallest efforts could ripple outward and make a difference. On the anniversary of his arrest, Marcus returned to the very intersection where it all began. This time, instead of flashing lights and handcuffs, there were smiles, hugs, and cheers. A mural had been painted on the side of a nearby building, a vibrant portrait of Marcus surrounded by words like justice, courage, and unity. Community members gathered to celebrate how far they'd come while acknowledging the work still ahead. Standing in front of the crowd, Marcus reflected on the past few years. "This moment wasn't mine alone," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It belonged to every person who marched, who spoke out, who refused to let fear silence them. Together, we've shown that no matter how broken the system may seem, it can be repaired, if we're willing to put in the work." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the streets like a promise. As Marcus stepped back into the crowd, shaking hands and sharing laughter. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But he also knew this: the power of collective action could move mountains. That evening, as Marcus sat on his porch watching the sunset, he allowed himself a rare moment of quiet pride. The city wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was better. And because of the courage of so many, it would continue to grow, to heal, and to strive for a future where justice truly belonged to everyone.